Welcome to Life Stories, where the quietest betrayals often leave the deepest scars. Imagine coming home for Thanksgiving, arms full of hope and homemade pie, only to find a silent house and a single note telling you that the people you trusted most have vanished without you. Left behind, not just with a broken heart, but with a dying man who knows far more than he ever let on. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about the moment when survival turns into strength and quiet endurance becomes a battle cry. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll question what family really means and what you would do when you're left with nothing but the truth. Let's step inside that empty house together and uncover what they tried so hard to hide. The sky over Maplewood had turned the color of wet cement by the time Cassidy Harmon pulled into the driveway. Her car engine ticked in protest as she shut it off, the only other sound the brittle scrape of dry leaves tumbling across the empty street. She sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, watching her breath fog the windshield, willing herself to feel the holiday spirit she had so carefully packed into the trunk with the pie tins and cranberry sauce. The house was dark. No porch light, no music, no smells of roasting turkey drifting through the air like every other Thanksgiving she had known. Cassidy frowned. Cassidy frowned. Ryan's mother Deborah had insisted they all meet here this year, said Frank wasn't well enough to travel, yet now the house looked abandoned like it had been asleep for years. The first step inside told her something was wrong. The heat was off, the air cold enough to make her shiver in her jacket. A rocking chair creaked faintly in the living room, and there, hunched in the chair like a ghost who had never quite managed to leave, sat Frank Harmon, Ryan's stepfather, draped in an old cardigan and a knitted blanket. On the coffee table next to him was a note. Cassidy's heart stumbled as she picked it up, her fingers already numb before she unfolded it. Gone on a Caribbean cruise with Brooke. Mom needed the break too. Stay and take care of Frank. He needs you. Be back Monday. Ryan. Cassidy read it again and again. It didn't make more sense the second or third time. The words blurred as a hollow sound filled her ears, the roaring emptiness of betrayal. Frank opened one eye and studied her, his gaze far too sharp for a man everyone had described as barely hanging on. "Shall we begin?" he said. Cassidy didn't answer. She couldn't. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her numbly into the kitchen, where she set down the grocery bags meant for a feast that would never happen. Her hands, still shaking, reached for her phone. Voicemail. Again and again. The silence swallowed her whole. Frank's cane thudded softly against the floor as he hobbled to the refrigerator and pulled out a half-empty bottle of water. "Been quiet like this all week?" he said. "They left Tuesday morning. Didn't even bother to stock the fridge." Cassidy felt like she had stepped into some parallel universe, one where love was performative and family was a transaction. "I don't understand," she whispered. Frank shrugged, unscrewing the cap with shaky hands. "Ryan's been looking for an exit for months. You just didn't want to see it." Cassidy stiffened, the words cutting deep. She opened Instagram with trembling fingers, already half knowing what she would find. The first photo gutted her. Ryan, smiling wide, champagne flute in hand, his arm wrapped around Brooke, the office friend Cassidy had quietly questioned for months. The caption read, "New beginnings, Caribbean escape. New beginnings." Cassidy pressed a hand to her stomach, afraid she might be sick. "They're not coming back," Frank said, watching her face. "At least not for you." Cassidy turned the screen toward him, needing him to see it too. Needing confirmation she wasn't hallucinating this betrayal. Frank nodded grimly. "I knew the first time she called the house. Pretty voice. Terrible laugh." Her knees buckled. She sat heavily in a kitchen chair, the cold seeping into her bones. Frank shuffled closer, setting down his water bottle. "They didn't just abandon you. They abandoned me too. But what they don't realize," his eyes gleamed with something fierce, something alive, "is that they left the wrong people behind." Cassidy blinked at him, confused. Frank leaned in. "I've been keeping records. Bank withdrawals, missed medications, every promise broken, every lie. They think I'm a doddering old man sitting here waiting to die." He smiled, and it was not a kind smile. They're wrong. Cassidy's mind reeled. She thought she had come here for a holiday, to be part of a family. Instead, she had walked into a war. You can walk away, Frank said, reading her hesitation. Or you can help me make sure they pay for what they've done. To both of us. A log cracked in the unused fireplace. Somewhere deep in the old house, pipes groaned as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Cassidy looked at Frank, really looked, and saw not a burden but a survivor. A man who had been waiting not for death, but for an ally. She thought about Ryan's promises, about the house he said they would buy, about the love he said he had for her. Lies, all of it. Her hands stilled, her heart hardened. Let's begin, she said. Outside, the storm finally broke, sleet tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Inside, two abandoned souls made their first quiet move in a game no one else even knew was being played. Have you ever reached a moment where the betrayal was so deep it turned your pain into power? What would you choose? Quiet suffering or righteous revenge? Cassidy thought the worst was behind her. But the true depth of Ryan's betrayal and Frank's hidden hand in it all was still waiting to surface. Continue to part 2. Frank led Cassidy into the back room, a space that smelled faintly of old paper and dust. It was once an office, now overtaken by hospital equipment shoved against the walls as if someone had tried and given up on caring properly. Under a flickering overhead light, Frank pulled open the bottom drawer of an aging oak desk and retrieved a thick manila folder, its edges dog-eared from frequent handling. These, he said, laying the folder on the table with a soft thud, are the receipts they never thought I'd keep. Cassidy opened it hesitantly. Inside were months, years of evidence. Bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals, medical appointments canceled without rescheduling, notes Frank had painstakingly scribbled in a shaky hand every time Deborah or Ryan had cut corners or ignored his care. At the top of the pile was something Cassidy hadn't expected, a doctor's report, grim in its precision. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Prognosis? Months at best. Cassidy felt the room tilt slightly, her fingers tightening on the folder. She looked up at Frank, who met her gaze without flinching. They know, he said simply. They knew when they booked the cruise, when they left you here, when they decided a week on a beach was worth more than a dying man's last holidays. Something in Cassidy cracked. She had been clinging somehow to the hope that Ryan had made a stupid, selfish mistake, not a deliberate choice. But this was cold, calculated abandonment. Her hands shook, not with grief, but with fury. How long have you known? She whispered. 3 months. Frank's voice was steady. Long enough to watch them circle like vultures. Long enough to realize the people I called family were only waiting for me to die. Quietly, conveniently. Cassidy pressed the folder closed, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. The man who had sat silently at Thanksgiving tables for years, the man she'd barely spoken to beyond polite holiday greetings, had seen everything, and he had been fighting alone. Not anymore. What do you want me to do? She asked. Frank gave a dry chuckle that turned into a brief, painful cough. Help me finish the record. Help me make sure that when they come crawling back, looking for what they think they're owed, there's nothing left for them but the truth. It sounded so simple. Justice. Retribution. The scales balanced at last. But Cassidy hesitated, because a part of her, deep down, still ached for something more human. A phone call from Ryan. A word of regret. An apology. A sign that the boy she once loved hadn't rotted entirely into the man who abandoned her here. And then Frank said the thing that shattered the last thread of doubt. There's more, he said quietly, tapping the side of the desk. Something you need to see. From a hidden compartment behind the drawer, Frank withdrew a second folder, this one thinner but heavier somehow. He slid it across the table. Inside were photos. Cassidy stared, her blood turning to ice. Surveillance images, low quality but unmistakable, of Ryan and Brooke not just on the cruise but at a bank a week before Thanksgiving. Ryan's hand resting on Brooke's lower back as she leaned over a counter, signing documents. Cassidy leaned closer, heart pounding. Joint accounts, Frank confirmed. He moved your savings. Transferred almost everything out of the accounts you shared, right under your nose. Cassidy's breath hitched. Her future, the house they had planned, the life she had imagined, was already gone. Ryan hadn't just left her for another woman. He had erased her. Every smile, every whispered promise, every casual touch that she had thought meant safety, security, love, it had all been transactional, measured, disposable. The weight of the betrayal pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. I kept waiting for you to see him, Frank said, not unkindly. But you loved the version he let you see. We all did. Cassidy closed her eyes, letting the hurt crash over her in waves. When she opened them, the world looked different. Sharper, harder. She wasn't here to patch things up anymore. She was here to survive, to witness, to make sure the truth saw the light. Frank pushed a battered notebook toward her. Let's get to work, he said. And Cassidy, with hands steadier than she would have believed possible just a few hours earlier, picked up the pen. Have you ever experienced a moment so raw that it transformed not only how you saw others, but also how you saw yourself? What would you do if someone you loved carefully dismantled your entire life behind your back? As Cassidy and Frank begin gathering their arsenal of truth, they have no idea just how deep the rot goes, or how far Cassidy will be willing to go once she sees it. Continue to part 3. The knock came just after noon. Cassidy glanced at Frank, who nodded from his spot in the armchair by the window. His breathing was shallow today, the skin around his eyes bruised with exhaustion, but the fire in him had not dimmed. Cassidy smoothed down her black sweater and opened the door. Ryan stood there, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his sunburned skin peeling along his nose. Brooke hovered behind him, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Deborah and Lindsay flanked them, their faces tight with practiced grief. Cassidy said nothing. She simply stepped aside and let them enter. The house swallowed them whole. Cassidy watched as their gazes darted around, confusion blooming. No Frank sitting at the table, no smell of roasting turkey, only the heavy, still air of absence. Where is he? Deborah asked, her voice brittle. Cassidy gestured toward the living room. Waiting. They filed in, their luggage thudding against the floor. Ryan dropped his bag near the door, hesitated when he saw Frank, then approached with a carefully constructed expression of sorrow. Hey, old man, he said, his voice too loud in the silence. We're here now. Frank opened his eyes slowly. His gaze swept over each of them, measuring, weighing, and then settled on Cassidy. Play it, he rasped. Cassidy picked up the tablet from the coffee table and pressed play. Victor's recorded testimony filled the room. His voice was weak but clear, recounting every slight, every moment of neglect, every cruelty disguised as inconvenience. He spoke of holidays spent alone while they vacationed, of medical treatments delayed to save money, of conversations he overheard where they debated how much longer he might last. Cassidy watched their faces as the words sank in. Brooke stiffened. Lindsay looked down at her shoes. Deborah's mouth hardened into a thin line. And Ryan flinched visibly when Frank detailed the financial theft, the betrayal of trust. When the recording ended, the room remained heavy with a silence so thick Cassidy thought it might crack. This is insane, Deborah burst out. He's confused, sick. You can't believe any of this. Cassidy walked to the dining table where the files were laid out. Bank statements, canceled appointments, photos of Ryan and Brooke at the bank, shifting their stolen savings into new accounts. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Ryan looked at her then, really looked, and Cassidy saw it in his eyes. The dawning realization that the game was over, that he hadn't just underestimated Frank. He had underestimated her. You think you've won? He spat. You think this makes you better? Cassidy tilted her head. No, just not like you. Brooke edged toward the door, mumbling about needing air. Lindsay followed, her expression crumpling into something like shame. Deborah stayed rooted to the spot, her face frozen in fury and disbelief. Ryan stepped closer, voice dropping low enough that only Cassidy could hear. You were nothing without me. She smiled, a small, sad thing. Maybe, but I survived you. Frank coughed from the chair, a wet, rattling sound that sliced through the room. Cassidy rushed to his side, but Frank lifted a trembling hand. "Let them go," he whispered. Cassidy stood, her body trembling with the force of everything she wasn't saying. She opened the door and waited. One by one, they left. No final words, no apologies, only the soft shuffle of feet and the bitter taste of endings. When the door closed, Cassidy locked it. Frank leaned back in the chair, his face pale and slack with exhaustion. Cassidy knelt beside him, taking his hand gently in hers. "You did it," she whispered. "You told the truth." Frank smiled faintly. "We did." That evening, as the sky turned the color of bruised lavender, Frank slipped away. No dramatic gasps, no final speeches, just a quiet, steady fading, like a tide going out. Cassidy stayed by his side until the end, reading from the old Raymond Chandler novel they had started together. She didn't cry. Not then. She let the stillness settle, honoring the man who had fought for dignity in a world that wanted to forget him. The funeral was small but sincere. The neighbors came. The old banker, Mr. Lot Whitman, spoke briefly about Frank's quiet generosity. Cassidy spoke last, her voice steady despite the crack in her heart. "He taught me that dignity isn't given by others. It's claimed, and it's defended." Afterward, Cassidy sat alone on the porch, the cold seeping into her bones. In her lap was the letter Frank had left for her alone, one last twist in a story full of them. In his will, Frank had left her not just the house, but the means to rebuild. Investments, hidden savings, a quiet empire he had protected for someone who had finally shown up when it mattered most. Inside the letter was a note, scrawled in a shaky hand. "Live well, Cassidy. Not to spite them, but because you deserve to." She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat, feeling the shape of it against her heart like a second heartbeat. For the first time in a long while, Cassidy smiled. A real smile. One touched with grief, yes, but also with hope. In the fading light of Maplewood, Cassidy Harmon finally, quietly, chose herself. What part of Cassidy and Frank's story moved you the most? If you enjoyed the journey, comment 100 below. Let us know which country you're watching from. Share this story with someone who needs to remember their worth. Thank you for watching Life Stories.